Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2022 Reuters Memorial Lecture. My name is Rasmus Nielsen. I'm director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and professor of political communication here at the University of Oxford. Welcome to those of you who are joining here in the lecture theatre at Lady Market Hall, and welcome to those of you who are watching this live online or watching this later on. I want to start by just thanking Seville, Mariana, Simon, and many of the other journalists who are reporting in Ukraine. Some of these are alumni of the Reuters Institute Journalist Fellowship. Most of them, of course, are not. I want to thank journalists in Russia trying to do their job under very difficult circumstances. Some of them alumni of our program, of course, most of them not, and journalists I can't and shouldn't name here tonight. And all their peers across the world who are working very hard, sometimes under incredible pressure and sometimes in personal danger, to help the rest of us better understand the world that we live in and shed light on. And I would ask you to join me in just a round of applause for these journalists in Ukraine right now. Tonight, we're very pleased to have Alessandra Galloni, the editor-in-chief of Reuters, as the memorial lecturer. She will talk about how Reuters, as a news agency, favored for its commitment to integrity, impartiality, and freedom from bias, is trying to help people across the world understand the world beyond personal experience, also in a crisis like the one we are seeing right now. We will have, after her lecture, a panel discussion chaired by Alan Rusbridger, the editor of Prospect and chair of the Reuters Institute Steering Committee, Noah Landau from RH, and Chair Sada Daneshku from the Financial Times, the head of editorial talent. But first, I want to invite all of you to join me in welcoming tonight's lecturer, Alessandra Galloni, for her lecture. Thank you very much.
Rasmus, is the audio working? Yes, can you hear me? And thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It really is an honor to be here for you today. And thank you for the beautiful tribute, Rasmus, that you gave to all our great journalists in Ukraine and Russia. That was a very apt tribute. So when I sat down several days ago to commit my thoughts to paper for this audience, Russian military vehicles were amassing north of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. News organizations were also preparing. Reporters, photographers, video journalists, fixers, drivers, security on the ground, alongside editors, producers, designers, fact-checkers, commentators in newsrooms around the world. So basically, the formidable journalistic firepower of many of the publishers, broadcasters, and agencies here today and in the audience. Ukrainians were mobilizing as well. They were taking up arms to defend their country against Russian forces, and they were deploying their smartphones to chronicle the war in real time for the world. You've seen them, videos of missiles over Kiev, of tutorials on how to drive a tank, of citizens setting up homemade bomb shelters, and of people crowding in underground stations. They have flooded the world's social media feeds.
Audio, hello? Ah, there you go. Yes, the potent modes of communication. They were crowding the world's social media feeds. You've all seen them. And even the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, was appealing directly to Russian TikTokers and to bloggers, among others, to stand up and help in the war. So social media platforms, which are sometimes referred to as the fifth of state, have for many years now democratized access to news and to other information. They've allowed more and more diverse voices to emerge beyond the authority, moneyed interests, and traditional media companies. And they've provided global audiences a faster, a better understanding of events such as wars, humanitarian disasters, historic political events as they unfold. Iran's Green Movement, the Arab Spring, the Syrian Civil War, and the Russia-Crimea War were all captured live from the mobile phones of people on the ground. The proliferation of this citizen journalism has skyrocketed as more people join social media channels every day. There are 4.5 billion people on social media globally, and that number is rising by around 1 million people a day. This is according to information technology consultants data poll. In the United States, user-generated content now accounts for 39% of media hours versus around 61% for traditional studio media. This is according to a recent report by Consumer Technology Association and YouGov. In Ukraine, nearly 60% of the 44 million population was registered on social media channels last year, and now they are recording their lives under siege, under bombardment, or as they escape from Kiev, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and other cities. This war in Ukraine, which has already been dubbed the TikTok war, is again forcing us in the traditional media to ask ourselves, so what is our role? So how does a profession whose principles were largely formed in the eras of print, of television, and for the millennial organizations among us, the World Wide Web, how do we remain relevant in an age of constantly evolving social media? And what do we do when actually most people in most of the world can access and can create news from anywhere just through their phones? Does global reach still matter when technology has made the planet smaller and given consumers more news than ever? So I would say, here's the thing. More information and better access is not always more and better. Social media and citizen journalists can be brilliant. They can give viewers a snapshot of what is happening and often a visceral, emotional taste of different aspects of what is going on. But they can't necessarily provide a true reflection of all the facts or a clear understanding of the big picture. The digitization of information has made it easier to get news from the other side of the world, but it has also made it easier to access unverifiable and distorted realities. As well as news, social media can carry fabrications, conspiracy theories, and propaganda. The current conflict has been no different. Unverifiable images of alleged attacks, footage from old conflicts, statements without proof, have all circulated widely, just in the last few days. In fact, there's so much that is untrue out there that it's hard to keep up. Just consider a few headlines, just items that we at Reuters had fact-checked ourselves. I'll read them for you. Fact check, no evidence Ukrainians are selling abandoned Russian tanks on eBay. Fact check, video of Russian and Ukrainian soldiers face-to-face is from Crimea in 2014. Fact check. Video shows wreckage from Beirut port blast, not the Ukraine war. Now, sources, named and unnamed, can make unverifiable claims. Just yesterday, we reported that Russian media had cited an unnamed Russian source saying that Ukraine was close to building a plutonium-based dirty bomb nuclear weapon. We noted in the headline and in the lead of the story that neither the Russian media nor Russian officials had given any evidence of that. But even assertions from named and official sources can be hard to verify. So when news broke out of a Russian attack on a nuclear plant last Friday morning, Ukraine's foreign minister tweeted news of the attack on the plant, which was Europe's largest. If it blew up, he said, it would be, quote, 10 times larger than Chernobyl. Although the person making the claim was the foreign minister, his information was difficult to fact-check, and for example, we disclosed that. In the end, the situation at the nuclear plant ended up not being as dire as initially feared. Even when fabrications are subsequently corrected, erasing misinformation is difficult, psychologists say, because the human mind creates formative thoughts that remain. Norbert Schwartz, who is a professor of psychology and marketing at the University of Southern California, puts it this way: if we later hear a correction, it doesn't invalidate our thoughts. And it's our own thoughts that can maintain a bias, even when we accept that the original information was false. Or, as Sally memorably scolded Harry in the Rob Reiner classic, you can't take it back because it's already out there. So what are the coastal defenses for this ocean of information that jumbles facts and falsehoods and washes up on our virtual beaches? I would say that at its best, impartial journalism can give a clearer understanding of the big picture. At its best, deeply reported journalism can take multiple strands of information and synthesize them into a coherent narrative with context that acknowledges what is not yet known. At its best, fact-based journalism can serve as an antidote to the disinformation that clogs up social media platforms more and more. At Reuters, I know my news organization best, we work to pursue independent, fact-based journalism that gives sound information to help people make decisions. And we believe that our global presence, combined with a deep local footprint, allows us to gather, to verify, and explain facts at the source. This, we believe, allows us to get closer to the truth. We are global. We have 2,500 journalists based in more than 150 countries around the world, but we're also deeply local. Our journalists come from 85 nations, and we publish in 15 languages. I myself, I'm Italian, and I started at Reuters in 1996 on the Italian language service in Rome. This combination of worldwide presence and local knowledge, a portmanteau that I often use is glocality, has long allowed us to spring into action where and when the news breaks, to deliver news from the ground, and to provide the kind of context that you can't when you parachute in. So when events happen, we've been there before, we are there during, and crucially, we remain long after others have left. When Russian tanks rolled into the outskirts of Donetsk city in the early hours of Tuesday, February 22nd, this was just hours after President Putin officially recognized the two breakaway regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, two Ukrainian journalists working for Reuters captured the first images of this momentous conflict. Let me give you another example from our reporting on COVID across Africa. Early in the pandemic, there were many fears and unknowns about how the COVID-19 virus would spread on the continent. And this was in part because of the lack of documented information about medical services. Even the World Health Organization and the Africa Centers for Disease Control didn't have a clear purchase on the resources that different countries in Africa had to fight the pandemic, because they didn't have adequate information from their members. So we decided to provide it from the source. We sent questions to health ministries and public health authorities across the continent, but that wasn't enough. Some countries didn't have the information themselves, and others didn't want to share it with us, or the WHO, or anyone else. So our local journalists took to the streets. They used their contacts to make multiple, sometimes frustrating, visits to government offices, public events, hospitals, doctors, and professional associations, and other sources to extract numbers and information that we needed. In the end, we compiled data for 48 out of Africa's 54 countries, allowing us to provide the most detailed picture publicly available worldwide at the time of Africa's readiness for the pandemic. This included the number of intensive care beds, ventilators, testing, critical care nurses, and anesthesiologists. Now, I want to say from the get-go, clearly we are not the only news organization that strives for impartiality and truth, and you've heard from others on this very stage who have the same public service mission. Most independent news organizations have their guiding principles, their stone tablets. Our commitment to truth is written into the way we operate. So in 1941, in the middle of World War II, threats of propaganda and censorship pushed the then managers of Reuters to establish a guiding code that we call the trust principles. These principles, and we include a link to them at the bottom of our stories on Reuters.com, commit us to independence, integrity, and freedom from bias. They are binding on all employees of our company, and a special board makes sure we uphold them. And believe you me, they do. Behind these principles is a series of basics that we try to adhere to every day. We want to be first, but we favor being right and safe over being first. We verify the facts, including when they come from the horse's mouth, and in fact, sometimes because they come from the horse's mouth. We practice no surprises journalism so that all subjects of our stories know what we are asserting about them before we publish, and we make real, not just perfunctory, effort to seek their view. We disclose key facts that we don't know, and we aim for neutrality of style and substance. I don't know how many editors among you here have noticed that when reporters tend to agree with a source, it's usually the source explains, and when the reporter tends not to agree with the source, it usually tends to be argues or insists. But what happens when there is a relentless and often malicious campaign on the very facts themselves and against those journalists who deliver them? What happens when trust in the media is in the trough? We all got a sobering lesson about the suppression of facts and their consequences during the pandemic. 6 million people have died as a result of the virus over the past 2 years. Yet, according to a February survey by Statista, 30% of people in India, 23% in South Africa, 15% in Poland, and 13% of Brazilians still believe COVID is a myth. And despite the overwhelming evidence in favor of vaccines in the United States, whose people have perhaps the highest access of information in the world, 1/3 of the population is, as yet, unvaccinated. In certain countries where we operate, the US or Britain, China, Russia, Egypt, Indonesia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Yemen, we chronicled deliberate efforts by these governments to underplay or squelch news about the severity of the COVID crisis. We systematically countered these official government narratives by gathering facts and statistics from non-official sources, like hospital medics or coroners or undertakers. In some cases, our reporting triggered serious pushback. In 2020, for example, we published an article saying that Iraq had thousands more confirmed COVID-19 cases than the 772 reported by the government. Iraq ordered Reuters to close our Baghdad bureau, to apologize, and to pay a fine. We refused. Eventually, the government relented, but it was only after lengthy conversations with officials and a public shaming of Iraq's then president by Christiane Amanpour of CNN. Reuters' Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer Danish Siddiqui was widely criticized in India when he chronicled how COVID was ravaging his country. He showed images of hospitals, of graveyards, and crowded funeral pyres. On Twitter, critics said the pictures were faked or against India's national interest. Siddiqui went on to cover the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. During that assignment, he was killed by Taliban fighters while covering a battle between them and Afghan special forces about a month before the fall of Kabul. He was 38. Sorry, hang on a second. Sorry. This is a dangerous time for journalists, especially relentless truth-tellers. In 2018, the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post columnist and prominent critic of Saudi Arabia by its government agents, shocked the world. Journalists who deliver accurate information also face violence, legal constraints, harassment, and other barriers to their work. The number of journalists jailed by their governments around the world set a record in 2021. And in the past several years, more than a dozen countries have imposed criminal laws against so-called fake news. These laws purport to apply to deliberate disinformation by journalists, but in practice, they're often used to bury the unflattering, unwelcome news that governments don't want published. China remains the biggest jailer for the third year in a row, with 50 journalists behind bars, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. Last year, for the first time, Hong Kong journalists were also sent to prison as China engaged in a brutal crackdown on press freedom following the territory's historic pro-democracy protests. Also in 2021, Myanmar became the second biggest jailer of journalists after its military coup. Egypt, Vietnam, and Belarus rounded out the top 5. In 2017, my colleagues Wallon and Chassou were framed, arrested, and sentenced to 7 years in prison because they accurately and fairly reported a horrific massacre of 10 Rohingya Muslim men by military and police forces in a Myanmar village called Indin. Despite public and private efforts by world leaders and our own intensive legal and publicity campaign, the 2 reporters remained in prison for more than 500 days. When they won a Pulitzer Prize in 2019 for their courageous coverage, they were still behind bars. They were eventually released in May 2019. Brazilian reporter Patricia Campos Melo delivered last year a harrowing speech about the aggression on journalists, in particular women journalists, in her country. Last year, Reuters video journalist Kumera Gamechu was arrested on Christmas Eve, detained in an Addis Ababa jail by Ethiopian federal police. Though he wasn't charged, he was kept in solitary confinement for 12 days. The police said they were investigating allegations that he disseminated fake news, assisted paramilitary groups, and breached anti-terrorism laws. Police suddenly dropped their investigation, and Gamechu was freed in early January. Even now, we don't know why he was incarcerated in the first place. We, of course, have continued covering the civil war in Ethiopia in great depth. And in the US journalists have been under intensifying pressure since 2017, when President Trump branded us, quote, some of the most dishonest people on earth, just 12 days into his presidency. From this stage a few years ago, former Washington Post editor Marty Baron gave us a chilling look at the attacks of the US president on journalists. Trump's demonization of the media has continued to reverberate widely since the January 6 Capitol Hill riot, where journalists, like police officers, were attacked by diehard Trump supporters. The hatred of journalists also figures prominently on the online sites that operate outside the mainstream. Last year, 2 of our reporters faced death threats as they published a year-long series about the campaign of violence and intimidation against state election officials and workers. The campaign of fear was orchestrated by Trump loyalists who refused to accept the outcome of the 2020 presidential vote. And in November, as Reuters unmasked the individuals who had issued these threats, our reporters also became victims via attacks and phone calls, voicemails, emails, texts, and messages on social media. One man told them, quote, "You're all done. You're all going to fucking burn." Our reporters are still digging. In Russia, the media are facing a new challenge. On Friday night, Moscow introduced a law prohibiting the publication of false information regarding the Russian armed forces. Violations by news organizations are punishable by up to 10 years imprisonment, with those carrying grave consequences carrying 15 years imprisonment. Some media companies, including the BBC, Bloomberg, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, have temporarily suspended their reporting on the ground. This law has yet to be applied, and we are all assessing the potential consequences of the measures. But we at Reuters remain determined to provide fact-based, trustworthy coverage of Russia in accordance with our trust principles. I take heart in the fact that actually the desire for fact-based objective news continues to exist around the world, even though, or maybe because, it risks being drowned out by alternative realities or vitriol on social media. According to the Reuters Institute, trust in news grew by 6 points on average during the COVID-19 pandemic, with 44% of the sample saying they trust news most of the time. A recent study from the American Press Institute said that a majority of Americans supported only one of journalism's 5 core values. But this particular value, that more facts lead to truth, is supported by fully 67% of Americans. One of the reasons for the traditional media's trust bump, COVID trust bump, several studies show, is that people consumed the news to make everyday personal decisions for themselves and for their loved ones. So, how to treat the symptoms of COVID, whether it was safe to travel, how to get vaccinations, or how to deal with online learning. I had my fair share of that. I learned a lesson in the value of sound information early on when I started as a financial journalist. Investors and traders need accurate information to make smart investment decisions. You make a mistake, they lose a lot of money, and they don't trust you again. You tell the truth, and even if they lose a lot of money, they come back to you. Another explanation suggested by the Reuters Institute researchers is that during the pandemic, journalists quoted more scientists and doctors, sources that are considered more reliable than politicians. So this taps into something broader, and that is a growing need to rethink whom we are speaking to as journalists if we want to get the real story. As often noted, the press failed in reporting the depth of support for Brexit in 2016 and the real possibility that Donald Trump would become president. The reason is that we were not tapped in enough or didn't listen enough to vast sections of the population outside our comfort zone. One of the initiatives we've launched at Reuters over the past year is called Back to the Source. It's a newsroom-wide effort to replenish and expand the diversity of voices and perspectives that we seek. So whether it's whom we talk to in the markets or whom we profile in a war zone, we're trying to be more thoughtful to make sure to capture the world as it is. And of course, it's easier to do that if those perspectives are reflected in our own newsroom. As the first woman in this job, and as a non-Anglo-American, I want to open our eyes to what hasn't been seen before. We also aim to be a check on misinformation. And perhaps it's paradoxical, but even as news consumers are being bombarded with disinformation from all sides, a global army of fact-checkers is working overtime to separate fact from fiction. A June 2021 census by the Duke Reporters Lab counted 341 active fact-checking initiatives operating in 102 countries. Facebook embarked on a program with independent fact-checking publishers in 2016. This followed widespread criticism of the way false information was allowed to circulate on its platform ahead of the US election. We are among those publishers, labeling content on Facebook and Instagram and publishing available fact-check articles in English, in Spanish, Arabic, and Hebrew on our website. 2,400 years ago, Aristotle identified 3 ingredients needed to persuade an audience. This rhetorical triangle still holds true today. Pathos speaks to the need of journalists to understand and deliver the information the audience thinks is important. The integrity of sourcing, the evidence behind the words, or logos, also counts, whether it be from a doctor, a data point, or a verified picture from a war zone. And that brings me to the third of Aristotle's triangle, ethos, or the credibility, the integrity of the speaker, or in this case, the journalist. For the public to trust us, we need to be trustworthy. When Donald Trump won the presidency in the United States, my predecessor, Steve Adler, issued a manifesto reminding us how we report in many countries where the media comes under attack. By doing our best to protect our journalists, by reporting fairly and honestly, by gathering hard-to-get information, and by remaining impartial. And that includes putting our opinions aside so that we can report without being suspected of an agenda. Here's how Steve put it in his memo. We operate with calm integrity, not just because it's in our rule book, but because, over 165 years, it has enabled us to do the best work and the most good. This is not easy now in Ukraine. It's hard not to have strong emotions at the images of buildings in flames, at civilians fleeing amid shelling, at refugee children in packed trains and pregnant mothers giving birth in bomb shelters. It's hard not to be angry at the propaganda. It's hard not to be anxious when your colleagues are on the streets of Irpin. It is hard to stay calm when friends fret that they'll be jailed for doing their job in Moscow. I've been in my job now for nearly a year, but let me tell you, it feels like a decade. The continuing pandemic, the death of our colleague Danish, the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban, and now war in Ukraine. It's a time of turmoil. The myriad challenges facing our journalists, as well as the journalists at so many other remarkable, resilient news organizations, it can sometimes feel overwhelming. At the same time, Europe faces its biggest crisis since World War II, and millions of citizens are relying on us as they never did before. For too many of them right now, the reliability of our news is existential. It's a matter of life and death. For those of us who are chronicling the first draft of history, this represents a huge responsibility and a historic opportunity. I hope we can make it our common mission to restore the faith in our profession that has eroded so sharply in recent years. A mission to demonstrate why trustworthy journalism, pursued without fear or favor, remains such a powerful force for the global public good. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alessandra, for that wonderful and incredibly up-to-the-minute. I joked that you were writing it on the train, but I suspect some of it was actually written on the train. And thank you to Noah and Scheherazade for joining us on the platform tonight. So Noah, who was a Reuters alumni, is now deputy editor of Haaretz in Israel. And previously served as the paper's news department, head of the news department, head of the English edition. And your work in Oxford, I think, involved the study of gag orders in Israel. And Scheherazade has been a staff journalist on the FT since 1990, if I read your bio right. You've worked in the leisure industries, economics, Paris. You've covered French banking and the consumer sections, and you're now director of editorial talent. What's that mean?
Well, I always find it difficult to encapsulate this in one sentence, but it's about promoting the best journalism, and that involves a lot of training and career development. The FT has become quite a complicated organization, so this is actually a newly created role that I have. It was created just 3 years ago.
For you, especially for you.
Well, not for me, I applied for it.
Alessandra, you ended on an optimistic note, but I think all journalists are wrestling with this issue of trust. And there was a period when the story we told ourselves was that in that wild west of crazy information out there, journalism would be a safe haven, and they would realize they needed us and they'd come back to us. Despite that COVID bump, it hasn't quite worked out as optimistically as that. Can you just elaborate a bit more why you think that hasn't happened?
I think there are many reasons, obviously. One is that there's just so much more information. So sifting between, true and untrue, between fact and fiction just becomes much harder. And so our voice kind of gets drowned. The voice of traditional journalism, if you say, sometimes gets drowned. I also think that we ourselves are partly to blame for this. I think, that the moment journalists wade into the debate, that they become part of the story, I think that potentially undermines the trust in us. Because if we show we have an agenda, then we become less credible. So I think partly it's external factors, but partly, I think we should look to ourselves and look at how we can improve. And that's why I talk about journalists being trustworthy. And I also think a lot is talked about this in media circles now, transparency. Tell people what we do and how we do it, right? I was struck a few years ago, I think it was Sky News here in the UK, one day just put a camera on its newsroom, live streamed a camera in its newsroom to show what people were doing. I thought that was brilliant. I think we need to do more of that to show, what this craft is made of. I clearly have an issue with that.
Yes. Noah,
Yeah, I've never been a radio journalist, nor do I plan to, I guess.
which bits of that from your experience of working in Israel, of Alessandra's whole speech, resonated most with you?
Well, I had to, is my audio working? Can you
Yes.
hear me? Okay, good. I had two thoughts. First, in the end, I mean, there's a lot to be said about subjectivity and objectivity, but in the end, the news is always told from the eyes of a specific person seeing the events. And I'm asking myself if we should hide it or we should be aware of it, because I think that on the other hand, part of the problem is that journalism always emphasized its objectivity. But for many people out there in the world, this objectivity wasn't objective at all. They saw things differently. They weren't amongst those people who their eyes saw what was reported. They weren't part of the game. And then it's really, I don't think I have an answer for it, but I think that going back to that maybe false objectivity that traditionally we attribute to journalism is not necessarily what we need. Sometimes part of transparency is being aware that sometimes we do have an agenda, and maybe that should be transparent to our readers as much as we can. I always tell, I also teach, and I tell my students, you know, when this question of subjectivity and objectivity rises, I always tell them, you know, the question is it not if there is a point of view or an agenda behind things, but are we critical and can we read it through what we see and read? Readers are critical as well, and they're more savvy, and they know to spot this false objectivity when they see it.
Just pause there, because I noticed you avoided the word you may not have avoided, but you didn't use the word objectivity. Are we talking about the same thing here?
It's a very key issue, right, that we face right now. And I would say that I didn't avoid it on purpose, by the way, but, you know, there is a lot of debate over, you know, the fact that we can't be objective, and those who pretend to be objective, it's hypocritical because everybody has an agenda. I mean, I would say two things. One is that I really believe that, you know, and tied to this is sort of the search for moral clarity. Rasmus talks about this in a recent, you know, paper. I really think that you cannot have moral clarity without factual truth. Without the foundation of facts, then you can opine if you want to, if you're in that business. But without a foundation of facts, you cannot have that. But your point is that a fact seen through my eyes can be different than a fact seen through your eyes. That does exist. I think the antidote to that is, therefore, let's have people like me, people like you, people like you, people like you in our newsrooms, and so that truth will emerge. In other words, we're not going to change human nature, but what we can do is we can change our newsrooms so that just diversity of perspective emerges. And if it doesn't emerge individually, it emerges collectively, and eventually the truth will come to the surface.
I'd love to know what the debate in the FT is like. I mean, it's Jay Rosen in America who's the big proponent of, you know, none of us is without bias. And actually, if we're transparent about our biases, then people will trust us more. I'm not going to trust you if you pretend that you have no bias. But do you have that debate inside the FT, or
Yes, I mean, I think
it's slightly an American debate?
Yes. I mean, what I'd say is that at the FT, what's really important is to distinguish news from opinion. So we label those very clearly that columnists are opinion writers, they are giving their opinion. It's not necessarily fact-based news, and that is separate. So I think the separation of those two is very important, and to make that clear to the reader. And then, you know, the reason why we have editors is in order to interrogate the reporter and to say, well, are you sure you saw that? Well, what about this other person's view? So that way you can get a more complete picture.
I want to ask you about data.
Yes.
You talked about data. And arguably the sort of rock stars of Twitter at the moment are Bellingcat and the incredible work they have been able to do, which left most mainstream journalists astounded and rather looking flat-footed. But the FT's got some very smart data journalists, and I'd love to hear from you about how you're getting into that world. Do you want to talk about?
Yes. I mean, we've been expanding our data and visual journalism, and we found that it's one of the things that our readers love the most. I mean, obviously, we are covering news through a business focus, so that's unsurprising given our readership. But our COVID coverage, particularly our COVID tracker, had a huge following and won awards. And I think you really couldn't argue with those. We looked at the data in many different forms. You would leave it at the end of the day for the reader to decide, but there were some things that were just incontrovertible, really. So data journalism, especially depending on the way it's presented, I think is a really good growth area. Certainly we found it to be so.
Is this the same with, I mean, it was, 10 or 20 years ago, journalism was for people who could write. But now we suddenly realize we need people who can work with numbers. Are you finding them easy to find?
Well, of course, during COVID, we had a huge data project. But I find myself wondering, we have too much data almost to handle. And the question goes back to the person, the editor or the writer on, what do we actually want to say with all this data? Because many times, we have all these data journalism stories that are just, you drown in numbers and facts and so on. And there's still a question, what is the actual story you're trying to tell here with all these different numbers? So our homepage, for example, had this, of course, really gorgeous dashboard with all the data and so on. But we had to keep reminding ourselves that we need to ask ourselves, what's the story we want to tell with the data and not the other way around.
Do you want to just elaborate a bit on how Reuters is working with?
I think that's a very, very good point. Yeah, no, I mean, look, we have so we talked about visuals and data, so let me talk about visuals first. I mean, our head of visuals is sitting right here, and there he is, John Pullman, and, we have a very big and important visuals operation, photographers, video journalists, and the producers, all the work that goes behind, to make what is shot on the ground then delivered to all the other broadcasters in the world. So we have a long-standing visual operation. What is interesting, though, and this speaks to the Bellingcat example, is that we have a growing division within Reuters that handles user-generated content. And that's been crucial, especially now, we were talking about it before, and especially now in Russia with the restrictions that we have user-generated, I mean, certainly in Ukraine, as I spoke about, but also now increasingly in Russia. But the key thing, and this is what, you're right, I mean, Bellingcat has had some incredible verification. The key thing is to have a machine that verifies the enormity of visuals that comes, through social media or through contacts. I mean, over the years, our UGC division has developed its own sources, people who they know on the ground and who are good at taking pictures or, taking video. And then we run, and those that we don't know, we run through the same verification that we do for our own stories. So you check the source, you call other people who are around to make sure that video actually did happen. You don't have, Beirut blast actually seeming like the Ukraine war. So that's visuals. In terms of data, we also have a big data department and growing. And we've done a plethora of stories, investigations on data. Last year, our Pulitzer Prize was based on a data project that looked at the number of times that a particular law called, or provision called qualified immunity had helped certain police officers get away with certain violence. So it is an area that is expanding. We certainly are expanding it. So yeah, I mean, the future is there. It's funny you say, before you looked at people who could write. Now we look at people who can count.
Yeah. A question for any of you to pick up on, and it's really a sort of generational thing. You talk about, you've got your visuals editor here. Are we seeing a shift with a younger generation who place less faith in words? So unless I can see it, I'm not going to trust it. If you want me to trust it, I want to see it. And therefore the onus on being able to show things rather than simply tell. I mean, that a lot of the most powerful things that we're seeing on Twitter now are these films that have been shot that immediately go viral, and some of them maybe not real, but they have a power that words maybe don't still have with a younger generation. I have no evidence for this. I mean, it's a question. What do you think?
I'll let others go first on that one.
I think I think the younger generation Z, okay, now they have letters, so I think they're much more savvy about visual online than probably the rest of us, because we just said that a lot of the visual material was actually false, and I think they know that words and visual are now. It doesn't. If it's filmed, it also doesn't necessarily mean it's true, right? Because
no,
we know
but
that
I mean,
pictures
the
and-
Black Lives Matter protest kicked off with that incredible film shot by an 18-year-old who then won the Pulitzer Prize for Courage, because it was kind of incontrovertible. She just stood there and she just unflinchingly recorded it. And it had a power to drive home something that intrinsically we all knew, but that video was a moment of ignition, wasn't it?
Didn't photos always have that power? I mean,
Some, to an extent.
In many wars in history and so on, and but still, it doesn't mean that it's more trustworthy than words.
Yeah, I mean, pictures tell 1,000 words, but I mean, you need both. You definitely need both, because it's with the words that you can explain the context, that you can talk to different sources. But as journalism, obviously our DNA is writing, but we've become more multimedia. And Alessandra, I think I read an interview when you were talking about how Reuters has verged more into long form as well. So each one of us has become more multimedia, so we have video and film too. But the footage that you're talking about, I think, goes beyond age. I mean, it affected everyone, whatever their age.
I was very interested in what you were saying about diversity, and you talked about your own role as the first woman to head Reuters, and you used the phrase you wanted to open our eyes to what hasn't been seen before. Can you talk a bit more about what you meant by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that clearly it goes back to what you were saying before. Because of who we are, we bring our own perspectives to how we cover the news, right? Personally, I have always tried to interview many women. I'm a financial journalist my whole life. I've always tried to interview the women in business, the women in finance. At the time, over the 35 years that I've been doing this, not because anybody told me. In fact, it was very difficult because often in financial journalism, you were the only woman in the room. But I was drawn to that not because anybody told me, and not even because I had an agenda or I knew what I was doing, that it was better to do so because you needed a diversity of voices, just because I was more attracted, to the woman in the room in the C-suite. And so I think that the world is varied, and the world is more than one category of person. And so if we are not inside our newsrooms a reflection of what is outside, then we can't properly cover it. And I think that was, you mentioned Black Lives Matter. I think that was Black Lives Matter. I think that was abundantly clear during Black Lives Matter, where large parts of US newsrooms missed the story, missed the real story, and that's because there wasn't enough Black representation in newsrooms in the US. But this is true for countless newsrooms. I feel that for us, I mean, we are diverse by our very nature at Reuters. As I said, we have 85 nationalities. And so I feel like it's our duty to reflect diversity at an international level, but also at a local level.
Can you talk a bit, you're head of editorial talent, and diversity must be a big part of what you're thinking about and how you change the balance.
Well, I agree with that totally, especially when you are covering news in a global context. We see ourselves as very much an international news organization, and therefore we have to have diversity and reflect those views. I mean, not only Black Lives Matter, but even Brexit. You know, if you don't have different, you have to avoid groupthink, basically. So yes, like other news organizations, we appointed a head of editorial diversity last year. We're running certain programs, and our goal is to make the newsroom more diverse, particularly under our editor, Rula Khalaf.
And is it like turning around a super tanker? Because I imagine not many people leave the FT because it's a very nice place to work. So your opportunities to hire are limited. So if you can say all you like, we want to change the workforce, but it must be quite a difficult.
No, we can make hires. Yeah, people do retire, people do leave.
No one ever left the Guardian. It was
Yeah, it's a true tenure of service is quite long at the FT, but nevertheless, we can't use that as an excuse by any means, and we don't want to. We genuinely want more diverse opinion. And it's not only, it's also really to do with socioeconomic background as well, so not only ethnicity.
You must be having this debate in your newsroom as well. Tell us about the debate in your newsroom.
Yeah, well, for us in Haaretz, it was mostly about how we include more Palestinian voices in our publication. We actually launched an initiative last year called Haaretz 21, which is an organizational incubator for giving more training and support for Palestinians in Israel that wish to be journalists. And we actually recruited 5 of them for full-time positions from the last cohort. So we are trying to make a bigger effort on that subject.
And is that? Do you feel that the coverage of Haaretz is already perceptibly different because of that?
I definitely think so. This is a project that I personally led and I'm very proud of it, and I think they are contributing a lot to our publication. In recent May, I don't know how many were following this, but we had probably the most violent clashes between Jews and Palestinians within Israel. And their perspective was crucial to our coverage of the events.
You talked a lot about sources. And I always felt there was a tension between the sort of inside the newsroom view of sources and outside. Well, I think it still exists that as a reader, but particularly, maybe the British press is particularly bad, but you can read an article about British politics that has 20 unnamed sources, and I'm expected as a reader to say, oh, well, that's all right, because it's the Daily Bugle or it's the Sunday whatever. In the internet world, that doesn't happen. People don't say, well, you just trust me because I work for this title. The best people on the internet show their evidence, don't they? They say, look, here's my link. Getting most journalists to link to anything is really hard, isn't it? I mean, that's a big effort, because they sort of think, well, why don't they just trust me? You know, why do I have to? Do you think there is that sort of?
Yeah, I mean, anonymous sources. You know, anonymous sources clearly have been important in many of the great investigations of the world. But we strive to have on the record sources. I mean, the best sources are those that go on the record. And interestingly, I'm a firm believer that if as a reporter, you do a lot of your homework first and you gather a lot of evidence first, and then you go to a source and present them with the evidence, that they will talk because it is human nature to want to somehow explain themselves. So I'm not a fan of anonymous sources. I'm certainly not a fan, and we see a lot of this in the press, of quoted anonymous sources. And so we should strive to have people on the record. When you need to have an anonymous source, and that happens for myriad reasons, the most important is because that person is afraid of the repercussions, it's really important to put that source into context so that the person who is reading gets a little bit of understanding as to why that source is in a position to know, to give as much information as you can as to why this person is in a position to know. So other evidence that you can build around that. That's not always, it's a platonic ideal, it's not always possible, but it's really, really important, because I think articles not only, it's important for you to be trusted, to be trustworthy, but also to appear so to the world.
Is there more that we can be doing in terms of winning trust? I mean, George Monbiot, who I once interviewed in this very room, I think is the only British journalist who has his own declaration of interests on his website. So every cup of tea that he gets, or any free book that he's been sent, and he puts his salary, he puts all his expenses. And the other thing that he does is he might publish a piece in The Guardian, and on his website he will put all the footnotes. And that's something that is common in academia. No academic would expect to be trusted if they didn't use footnotes to say, this is how I know what I know. I mean, are journalists are going to have to think in a way more like academics in showing their workings?
I mean, he's a columnist, basically, right? So
he's a columnist, yeah. but he wants to be trusted, because I think he got fed up with being attacked and said, "Oh, you're just George Monbiot, this is just your," and he wants to say, "No, but my views are very. Look, here's how you know. Here's the evidence for what I'm saying."
Yes. Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, what you're covering. I mean, news is so fast these days that I can't really imagine that having footnotes and things in a news story. I mean, obviously, you do have hyperlinks to various reports and things that you might be quoting, so that people can go and see the primary source. We certainly put those in news stories. And on the question of anonymous sources, I mean, we'll only talk to. Obviously, we would prefer everyone to be on the record. But I mean, for example, our Wirecard story, which was a 5-year investigation into a multi-billion-dollar fraud, we couldn't have done that, putting people on the record, but it turned out to be true. We knew it was true. It was something that we just had to build up, and it took that amount of time. But you can see that's very different from putting in footnotes and things.
Sorry, just the difference.
And I don't want to clarify, because anonymous sources are crucially important to getting information. And investigations rely on anonymous sources all the time. But you were talking about the quoting of anonymous sources, and you reader have to believe me. That's different, right? Because show me the evidence that I have to believe you. So I think that's the difference. Here, the quoting of so-and-so saying someone is an idiot, said so-and-so. Yeah. Well, who is saying it, especially when you're saying something negative? So I think that's the difference.
Especially when you're saying something negative, that should be kept to a minimum. I totally agree.
Well, so-and-so that says that someone is an idiot is a genre really popular in Israel within the government. Ministers like to be quoted off the record anonymously saying, bad things about one another. This is really a genre.
And the New York Times at one point had I don't know if anybody can confirm this is still the fact, but they used to have a style book thing that prohibited the use of pejorative anonymous quotes. So they just wouldn't allow it, but maybe that's... I'm hoping we've got some questions from the audience, and we have a roving microphone, so if somebody puts a hand up, there's one right behind you up there.
Hello. Is this working? I'd love to get a sense of what your collective views are around the rules around Twitter and journalists' use of Twitter. I mean, for example, I know that Lionel Barber at the FT still is a prolific Twitter user. When you're trying to convey the truth, I know you use Twitter very actively. When you're trying to project the truth and a sense of your senior people in the newsroom and being objective, isn't it dangerous to be very active on Twitter? Do you all have rule books? I'm particularly interested on the Reuters point of view around this. Alan, you're all over Twitter. If we're trying to, as journalists, as media organizations, be objective, is this not a place where there are several pitfalls in that?
Scheherazade, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are lots of pitfalls, and we have social media guidelines about what you can and can't post. For example, you can't say what your political affiliation is. What you have to think about on social media is you as a reporter, exactly the issue of objectivity. Could your objectivity be called into account depending on what you post on Twitter? So although journalists like to build up a personality and a profile and followers, nevertheless, you can't let it get too far or controversial. You mustn't get into a fight with people. We do have rules and guidelines on it.
No?
I love and I hate Twitter. I really do at the same time. I think for journalists of my generation, it's really hard to make it out there without Twitter. We saw this also with our Howard 21 group. Part of the training was not only to do good journalism, but also how to tell the story on Twitter so that people know that you actually told this story and that the story exists and that it gets follows. And it's really it's a tool. It's part of our job now. I think it's really difficult to stand out without it these days. Maybe for some journalists, that they started their career and built a reputation before Twitter, then they don't have to. But for young journalists, they kind of do. And on the other hand, of course, it has a lot of risks. You really need to be careful what you say. The most important tool doesn't exist on Twitter, which is edit, which is what we do. We're journalists, we're editors, and Twitter doesn't have an edit button, or even think a few seconds before you hit tweet. Even that doesn't exist, which is definitely something that I recommend to anyone on Twitter to do, just to think just a second before you press, tweet.
Or the breathalyzer function to see how much you've drunk before you tweet.
That also could be useful. We actually do not have official regulations on what journalists can or cannot do online. It's part, I think, of just the DNA of the newspaper. We don't.
And how often does it get a journalist into trouble? I mean, maybe this is a question for both of you. I mean, have you had to tell a journalist off for saying something that they shouldn't have said? Either of you?
It does happen, but
Yeah.
I think people learn from that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And microphone.
I mean, first of all, thank God I didn't start in the age of Twitter because I would have gotten nowhere. But I think it's really important. Whatever you put on, we always say, just to be careful, because whatever you put on Twitter, as you say, could compromise your ability to report. Because again, it's not only about being trustworthy, it is about seeming trustworthy. And I always tell people when we get into, issues, a few things. First of all, if you're tweeting your story or about your story and we edited something out because it was unverified or, because it showed a particular bent, like the, argued versus explained, example that I gave before. Try not to go beyond that on Twitter, because if it was taken out of your article to begin with, then there must have been a reason, right? But also, we always tell our journalists, think about if somebody were to take that, what is the worst possible headline that could eventuate from what you've just written on Twitter with your name and with the name of Reuters associated to it? Just think about that before you tweet. That being said, it's an incredible tool for amplification. It has impact. I mean, we've seen just already in the last few days of the Ukraine war, I mean, Twitter and the other platforms have been an incredible mechanism to get people to understand. So I think it's a balance.
Question from Lord Patton.
A very contemporary issue here at the moment, not least in relation to Ukraine and Russia. We're very used to countries where there's rule by law, the law being used, Russia, China, Hong Kong, to stop freedom of speech, to stop people saying what they think is going on. Here we have the rule of law, and we see the courts being used to stop journalists and writers saying what's going on. Do you want to comment on that, and any thoughts about how we should deal with it?
When you say here, you mean in this country or in general?
In this country, yeah.
Slaps.
In London.
We were talking
Libel
earlier
capital
in the board meeting about the use of so-called slaps,
Yeah.
and the use of, by Russian oligarchs to silence books and...
Yeah, I mean,
We luckily have a brilliant general counsel who deals with a lot of this. So, and I don't feel equipped personally to speak in the details of the UK situation. Certainly around the world and also in the United States, we've just seen a recent case. We are seeing increased attempts to, for example, criminalize mistakes, the criminalized mistakes of journalists, which is very dangerous because, as I said before, we are writing the first draft of history, and sometimes we cannot get it totally right. Sometimes we get it wrong, and then it's upon us to correct us. But if that becomes criminalized, then you can self-censor, and it thwarts the ability of journalists. So, as a general comment, I would say.
Do either of you want to come in on that? If not, we'll take another question at the back there. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Mrs. Galloni. You told for the Reuters Institute in the interview, you said that you were already there in Ukraine when the war started, that you were ready. Kind of. I wanted to ask you to elaborate that. How were you prepared for the war? How were your journalists prepared for the war?
So when I said we were there, in what I meant was that we have long had a bureau there. So we have journalists who are there, and this bureau is made up both of Ukrainian nationals and of foreign of people from non-Ukrainian nationals. So we were prepared in the sense that we were living and reporting on everything that happened in the weeks and months before the war, but also in the years before the war. So the institutional memory to know about what had been happening steadily. In terms of preparation on the ground, I mean, John is here, and it was vital for us to have such, and we still have many, I would say, photojournalists and video journalists on the ground. When it was clear that this conflict was turning into a war and we would be chronicling violence and the invasion, the first thing is safety, and we have very lengthy safety protocols that we go through, and it was no different in this case. And this is for people who are on the ground, this is for people who are coming in, this includes security advisors, this includes preparation. People will go in to cover a war zone only if they have certain training and certain equipment. To which, by the way, and this is interesting in the context, I think, of talent, to which we have recently added increased attention on mental health. Because obviously PTSD is a very big issue among journalists, especially after covering conflicts. So this is an element that we've introduced. So I think there was the general preparation of understanding the lead up to this conflict, and then there was the more immediate preparation, which was safety in particular. In addition to understanding who would go, a big logistical operation, obviously, and we have lots of people who support our people on the ground.
Is mental health of journalists becoming a bigger part of your job?
I mean, yes, anxiety and stress is definitely part of a journalist's daily life. So yes, we have mental health help. Yeah, definitely, it's an issue.
Tim.
Timothy Garton-Ash. First of all, thank you for a terrific lecture. I have a small question and a larger one. The small question is that, as you know, in Russia now, it is illegal to call the war in Ukraine a war. Indeed, I just saw on Twitter that Lavrov has just said the special military operation in Ukraine is to prevent a war in Ukraine. Orwell would be proud of that. What do your correspondents, Russia-based correspondents, call it? And the larger question is, you all emphasized very much diversity, but Reuters is still a Western news organization, as is AFP and AP. Now, obviously, some people in China or India or elsewhere like it precisely because it is, but do you think there's a credibility and trust problem that you have, say, in India or China and Africa, that derives simply from being a Western news organization? And how do you address that problem?
So first of all, the Reuters file on Ukraine is international. We're covering the war from many countries. It is we are calling it an invasion. It was so, and so we are covering it. Well, our file is international, so it's not like one part of the company or one part of the newsroom calls it one thing and another calls it another. Obviously, we're very aware of the situation, and so we are currently assessing, the situation of our journalists on the ground, as every other news organization is. It's still very fluid. On the bigger point. You make an interesting point. Actually, we have our biggest single bureau in India. We have more than 500 people in Bangalore. And we have very big bureaus across Asia. China, our headquarters, we have we have three headquarters around the world, Singapore, London, and New York. And these have sort of equal standing in the organization. Yes, overall, if you counted the number of people, yeah, we'd probably have more sort of west, than east. But really, we're trying, and I think we've succeeded over the last few months to make our footprint truly global. It's a good question. What do our correspondents, feel in Asia? I mean, many of those then come and work in the U.S. or come and work in Europe. Then others go back. There is a lot of movement. So, look, I think we've come a long way in not sort of having this east-west or north-south divide at Reuters. Have we done everything? No. But I think we really have come a long way because we have such a footprint in Asia, particularly in India, in fact.
Yes, question right at the back. There's some questions up here. Right, okay, sorry. Yeah, we have one on the back and then two more there, and that's probably all we've got time for. So.
Alessandra, thank you for the lecture. You spoke quite a bit about values and moral clarity. How do you reconcile that with the fact that in India, you have a commercial and content partnership, a lucrative one, I imagine, with ANI, which is a news agency whose sole purpose, at least since the Hindu nationalists came to power in 2014, has been to demonize Muslims, has been to spread bigotry. There's hardly a day goes by when they don't spread fake news, when they don't doctor videos. Their editor acts as sort of a personal publicist for Mr. Modi. And you mentioned how Danish Siddiqui and other reporters were criticized and like really badly for showing pictures of funeral pyres. One of the leading voices was Samita Prakash, the editor of ANI. And in fact, there's now sort of a genre of fact-checking in India which is devoted entirely to debunking fake news from ANI. So how does that work?
First of all, I'm going to ask my colleague John to give the very bare bones details of how our partnership with ANI works out, and then I can give sort of the big picture, which is true in general for Reuters.
John.
So yes, we have a business relationship with ANI. They provide video which we independently verify, and we choose a selection of ANI video. So it's a very particular, careful relationship. We're not responsible for the work ANI do in India more generally. A subset of content that ANI produce is passed through the Reuters verification system and appears on the Reuters platform.
So the point is that, like with anything that is not ours, we pass it through our strictest verification systems, and it's not just verification of fact; it's verification of tone and fairness. And we do this in India, but we do this with anything that is not news gathered by ourselves.
A couple of questions right up there.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask where you all believe the future of journalism will be in 10 years. So what you think journalism may look like when perhaps Gen Z, like our generation, are in the newsrooms.
Noah, do you want to?
Sure. Well, one thing I learned as a reporter is not to be a prophet, right? Because we're wrong a lot of the time. So I can't really give you a prophecy of how journalism will look like. But I do hope that we will know how to navigate growing digitalization, personalization, algorithms, data, traffic, etc., with the basics of journalism, of reporting from the ground and doing our work just like it has been done for so many years. I hope that that part doesn't change so much. I even have an example. I think, by the way, the war in Ukraine is a very good example of why you still need people on the ground doing the same thing that they did throughout history, because this is the most, as you mentioned, Alan, this is a war, this is the TikTok war, right? This is the war that is most photographed, most, Instagrammed, etc. And still, we know very little. We know very little of what is actually happening. Give you an example that there was a report about how the Russians bombarded the Holocaust Memorial of Babi Yar. It was reported everywhere, as if it actually happened, because the Ukrainians, reported that the memorial was harmed in the bombardment, etc. And an Israeli journalist, one of the few that was still in Kiev, and he is still in Kiev, and this is a guy, he's now more than 80 years old. He's been covering wars for his whole life, and he insisted that, to go and do the same thing that he's been doing his whole life in the Ukraine. He went in Kiev to the memorial, took a picture, and told the world, not true. The memorial is fine, which is, I don't know if it's so important when other people, people are dying. I care less about memorials when people are dying, but still he did the same thing, that I hope the future of journalism will still look like that as well.
Shehrazad, do you want to be a prophet and say what's going to happen?
Well, I mean, when I joined the FT 30 years ago, it was pre-internet, which I know for you is just unimaginable. And so none of us could have predicted the internet. And also when I joined, we were 300 journalists. Now we're 600. So that gives me a lot of optimism about the future, because I think there'll always be demand for quality, independent news, more and more so.
Do you want to have a crystal ball?
Absolutely not. You never predict the future. No, I think the future is exciting, though, for journalism. I mean, also when I started, as you said, you look for people who could write or people maybe who could shoot a photograph. Now it's just the people who are coming in are early career journalists. I mean, they're ambidextrous in visuals, text, graphics, data, social media, verification, fact-checking. I mean, you can come into journalism from so many different areas now, and with so many different tools that the pie has become bigger. It's a much more exciting space than when I started. So I think it's really exciting, which is why I'm optimistic. So you have all this bouquet of tools, and at the same time you have a great need for independent and fair journalism. You put those things together and it's just a wonderful world out there.
That would be a lovely note on which to end, but we have one more question. So please don't go and ruin it.
I was trying to make it poetic because it was the last one.
Well, I hope it works, but I was thinking, and thanks for the lecture, but you mentioned the importance of set opinions aside. But you also mentioned that sometimes it is impossible not to feel compassion, not to be exhausted, not to feel rage in face of propaganda or fear. And I would like to, maybe you could share with us more, how do you make that balance? And which is the role of empathy in the covering, for example, the war in Ukraine?
Just for me, that question.
Whoever wants.
So basically, how you balance the emotion that is inevitable because we are human with the pursuit of fact-based journalism.
Yeah, but maybe it's more than emotion. Maybe it is indignation. Maybe what you are witness of something that is great. So, and there is a role for empathy in journalism. So how do we make that balance? I know it's difficult. That's why I'm asking it.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Look, I think that of course you have to have empathy. Of course, our photographer, one of our photographers yesterday was in that part of Kiev, which everybody saw the images of civilians killed and running away. And I chatted with him later in the evening, and it's difficult. We're humans, we're not robots, right? And when you chronicle something like that, you bring empathy to it. It's what draws you to what is happening on the ground. Danish Siddiqui used to say that it was such a privilege for him to witness humanity in good and bad and everything in between. So I think you have to be empathetic, to understand where to go, to understand who to shoot, who to photography shoot, who to talk to. But at the same time, I think you have to put aside your agenda, your opinion, because what helps the world, I really think, is knowing facts, is not knowing your personal opinion. That's what helps others. People don't want to know what I think. People want to know what my news organization, what the news organization that I lead, what they are finding, what they're finding on the ground. They don't want to know what we think. And I think that's the foundation. I think you can have empathy, but I think when you are searching for the truth, when you're searching for facts on the ground, you have to put aside your personal animus, your personal ideas, and you have to try your best to find those facts. And that's different from what you were saying, which is you can see the world in a different way by who you are. That's okay. But that's what I strongly believe anyway.
No, you can have the last word, but you have to be positive.
So that's going to be a full circle, which is not necessarily positive, but at least a full circle for the end, which is that I'm going to say that you should not put aside your opinions, you should be aware of them, and you should do your best to acknowledge the fact that you have an opinion about the situation and seek the other opinions from that perspective in order to understand the side that you do not understand, which, for example, we're all seeing right now the coverage of the war in Ukraine. What do we actually know about the Russian position? I'm not sure that enough. So you need to be curious and aware of your own position to seek the other position.
I think it's time we went for a drink. But I don't want to end this without, first of all, thanking this brilliant panel. I think these are three great news organizations led by great women, and particularly for Alessandra for such a up-to-the-moment tackling the really difficult issues that you're having to deal with in your position, but at the same time doing something that was very upbeat and inspiring and full of hope for the future. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for the team at Reuters for putting this on, and for LMH. Thank you. I think we can once again applaud Alessandra. We're going to head out there. If you sort of head out, whatever that is, 10 o'clock. You can tell my military background was a sketchy one. I think it's 10 o'clock out of the door. But anyway, over there, follow your noses. You will find a drink. And thank you for coming. And Alessandra, thank you for a wonderful lecture.